So customer panels, we touched on this last week in our conversation, and you thought it would be a good idea to go through some more of the nuts and bolts that how do you put something together, and how do you make it happen, and how do you get what you need to out of a panel without going crazy on it? And for me, I think one of the keys to success is you got to know why you're doing the panel in the first place.
And there are different points in a company's life when it makes sense to do this. Obviously, early in product development, because you need to be able to get in front of customers around whether or not this thing that you're trying to build is something that they want to buy and that they're willing to buy with these features at this price. There are a lot of companies that discover only too late that no one wants to buy this thing at the price that they're selling it for. And there's no way to make it cheaper. You basically, $10 million in, discover you don't have a business. The most important place to do this is pre-product launch, to try to understand the market that you're launching into. The third area where I tend to do a lot of these is you have a company that's got a product that's been in market for a year or 2 years. There's no market traction. You've got salespeople out there, no one's buying. And so the question is, are we trying to sell it to the wrong people? Do we not understand how they see value in these sorts of products? Are we solving a problem that doesn't really exist, or a problem that isn't particularly valuable, or a problem that's already being well solved somewhere else? And the way to understand these things is to get out there and talk to the sort of people who are potentially your future buyers, and to hear from them how they view their problems, how they talk about the problems, and how they view the potential solutions to those problems. And you can do this in a very random way, or you can do this in a very structured way. And the structured way is generally this process called developing customer panels, where you have a specific panel of people that you're going to go to for interviews to try to get a deeper understanding of how they think about, again, the sorts of problems that your product or your service is solving.
Right. So the situations you described, I think the last one where you're performing a panel as a reaction to some sort of negative news, and you're trying to conduct market research simultaneously with sales efforts, it can lead to problems, right? It can lead to conflict. You definitely do not want to have your salespeople pivot from spending time trying to get meetings in order to sell product to spending time trying to get meetings in order to do customer research, because
Right.
the incentives are all wrong, and you will get a lower response rate, probably taint your results. And it's not wise to do that. And so if you find yourself in that kind of reactive situation where you realize that something is wrong about your value proposition, or something is wrong about your messaging, and it's a good reflex to try to do some research and investigation to understand why that is. But so how can you do that without sidelining or co-opting other commercial efforts you have going on?
And one of the recommendations I usually make is don't have salespeople involved. And ideally,
we don't even want to be involved. We just want
but ideally have an outside group do the work. And so one of the things that's a potential issue is biasing your sample population. And there's a couple of ways you can bias them. A certain percentage of these people are going to assume that your market research is a Trojan horse for some kind of sales or some kind of a pitch. And so they're going to lie to you about what their needs are because they don't want to be pitched to, or they don't want to be pitched to right now. Then there's another slice of the population that, if they know that it's you asking a question about yourself, they're going to feel bad about saying bad things about you to you. And so they're going to lie to you, and they're going to tell you things that aren't true because they don't want to hurt your feelings. And so there's a real advantage to either go with an outside group to execute this, or if you're going to do it in-house, to do this as though you were an outside group that set up a simple website with a landing page, for instance, that's completely separate from your primary website. Don't represent yourself as an employee of the company, that you're trying to do a completely independent research. And ideally, what you would like is for them to not know who's sponsoring the research. One of the things that you also want to be able to get out of these panels down the road are things like brand awareness. If you give them a list of competitors, are they able to pick out which ones sell a similar product? Are they able to pick your name out of that list as someone that sells in that category? And so if you give away the game up front by telling them who you are, it makes this sort of research down the road very difficult, where if you can keep it, at least the facade of it, as a neutral third-party effort, you are far more likely to get more useful and more unbiased information from the people that you interview.
I asked everybody I know about my products, and they all say they're great. So the key with the trap there is everybody I know. You need to ask the people that you don't know, and that's really, I think, one of the hardest barriers for people that are trying to do this themselves. It's also a barrier for consultants, because it's not any easier for the consultant. The consultant just knows how to do it faster and less expensively, but it's still a barrier. And so how can you start to assemble a group of useful respondents to customer panel research?
And the important thing here is everyone talks about you need to talk to your customer, which is important. But what's more important is you need to talk to people who are not your customer, because you're going to get market traction and you're going to grow by selling to people who have not bought from you before.
Wait a minute. The only reason they're not my customers is because I haven't talked to them yet, right? The logic that goes on is it better for me to spend my time to attract these people from my market research, or attract them to try to buy my product? That trade-off is just so seductive, especially when you start talking to somebody and they're responding in the ways that you are hoping that they would. And to hold back from turning that into a sale, it's hard.
It's hard, but you got to resist the temptation. And again, this is why it's useful to have third parties actually doing the legwork on this. And it's something that you can't simply just turn over wholesale to a third party, because the people that you're talking to have to be really unique to your company and your product. You can't just do a random survey. And so this goes back to who should you be talking to? And the people you should be talking to are people that are in what I call your core ICP, your core ideal customer profile. So who are the people that are most likely to be future customers over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years for your product? And most of these people that you're talking to need to be people who don't already have a relationship with the company. And the reason why is that the people who were sufficiently interested to have a sales conversation, even if they didn't buy, or ones that were convinced to buy, this is a very tiny self-selected subset of your market. And these are basically the people where whatever you're doing right now worked. But the problem you're trying to solve is, what do I need to be doing for all the people out there who've not talked to us yet? And are we doing things that are in some way not working for all of these other people? Even though it's called a customer panel, it's really composed primarily of potential future customers, not necessarily current customers.
Right. So how do you actually recruit these people? Right.
A reasonable first place to start is your own CRM. Look at people that, because likely you've got people that you've had, either names you've already gathered, or people that you've had some contact with, or existing customers. So it's fine to start with that as a list. But again, generally what you want to do is to identify a broader population. And my recommendation is usually to target around 4,000 or 5,000 names, which is sufficient for most companies. Again, you're not selling laundry detergent, so you don't need to interview 10 million people. You're selling something very specific that a relatively small group of people are going to potentially buy. So where do you get those names? If you're in research tools, a great place is something like the NIH grant database. If you're selling a diagnostic product, you should already be pulling insurance reimbursement data. And those data sets will give you the names of physicians who are working with patients that have conditions that match, the product that you're trying to sell. You can also go to places like LinkedIn, obviously. And then there are special services like Exact Data or Zoom Info, where you can buy lists based on criteria. And many of these lists that you put together may have names, but not have email addresses, or not have complete email addresses. And so there are what are called data enrichment services that you can submit blocks of names, and they will then come back to you with email addresses. And it's not terribly expensive. It's not terribly complicated. Zoom Info is one of these companies that does this service. There are quite a number of others. But you start with essentially a list of names and email addresses. And you begin with what I call a qualifying survey. So you send out a simple survey of half a dozen questions or so. So this needs to be quick and easy for them. And what the survey is trying to do is to qualify this population as potential customers. So are these people that either have bought or are likely to buy the thing that you're selling? And some percentage of those are not going to be, some percent, if you've done your homework on building the list, most of them should be. But typically on that qualifying survey, what you'll see is maybe a 5 to 10% response rate. So it's not going to be very high. Most people will ignore it. But out of that, you should be able to come up with a list of typically 200-300 names that responded to you and that are clearly in your core ICP. And that's more than enough. And then out of those 200 or 300 names, what you want to do is to then send basically an invitation email to that group, explaining that you're doing market research on this certain topic, and then explain what's involved. And what's going to be involved is setting up basically a 20-minute Zoom meeting to answer a few questions. And again, your response rate on that is probably going to be fairly small. But what you're looking for is really only 20 or 30 names of people who are willing to be interviewed. And you're probably only going to use less than half of those, at least in the initial interview. So the goal is you start with 4,000 or 5,000 names that are potentially in your ICP. You're looking for as few as 15 or 20 people who are willing to have a conversation with you that are solidly solidly represent a potential future customer for your product.
So what is your position on incentives to respond to your qualifying survey? Is this something where you want to apply incentives to get the responses you need? 4,000 people can be a heavy lift. So let's say I'm working in research tools and I want to sell 3D tissue models for kidney disease. That I would be surprised if the total market size is even $4,000 or 4,000 people. It were more like 400 people would be the total market size. When we're dealing with a potential market that small, is that a good place to use incentives, or is there a different approach we should be taking?
As a general rule, I tend to avoid incentives because, I think it can bias the answers. You're going to get people raising their hand and wanting to talk to you, not because they have something useful to say, but because they want a $50 Amazon card. There are exceptions to this. One of these is in diagnostics, where you're trying to talk to physicians. Physicians tend to not control their own schedule. They tend to be grossly overscheduled, and it's reasonable to offer to pay them basically at their full consultation rate to have the conversation with them. But in most cases, I will typically try to avoid doing incentives unless that's the only way to be able to get a large enough group.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take on incentives. I like incentives as a way to show that you're serious about doing the research and doing the survey. And I think we've all gotten that sort of $25 or $50, or sometimes it's like a giveaway. It's, if you respond to the survey, you have a chance of maybe 1 in 1,000, or if I'm on your list, 1 in 4,000 of winning an iPad or something like that. I have an iPad. In fact, everybody on your list probably also has an iPad. I think the $25 like Starbucks card is more tangible, but I think there's also some creative approaches you can take. I've done charity contributions. So if every response we get on this survey, we donate a certain amount to this particular charity. And I think I'm willing to make the trade-off of a little bit of bias in order to boost the response rate. And part of that just comes from my history of having run surveys like this to try to recruit people for research. And it's hard. It's hard. It's not easier if you're a consultant, but consultants generally have a better experience and expectations. They can do it a little bit more efficiently, but it's still hard.
Right. If you are going to do a giveaway, give away something certain, not something that is a 1 in 5,000 chance of. I mean, even if it's a 1 in 5,000 chance if you're going to give away a BMW, it's probably still not enough. And my experience has been that these sort of 1 in X chance of a drawing is essentially worthless.
Yeah. So we did get a question here from Frank. And so he's wondering about the importance of recruiting particular types of ICPs with purchase authority versus ICPs without purchase authority. And so I think it'd be interesting to untangle this a little bit. So when I think of an ICP, I think of the account level being the customer. So it is the Janish lab at Harvard that's the unit of my ICP. That's the customer. It's not Harvard. It's not Rudolph Janish. It's the Janish lab. And then within that, you have the PI, who's going to have the purchase authority, and you have bench researchers who do not, but potentially have some influence over the purchase. And I think within an ICP, you have those different personas, right? So when we're doing panel recruitment, should we be recruiting all personas or only some?
I would say all, because even if you cannot sign your name on the PO, you still likely will have not just influence over the decision, but you'll still have insight that we could use as marketers to better understand how to position the product, how to talk about the product, and be able to develop some understanding on how the product and how the product category is seen. What we're looking for here isn't necessarily people who are ready to buy tomorrow. What we're looking for is anyone that has an informed opinion about how potential buyers think about this. And the fact is that postdoc today could be a PI in a year and have that direct purchase authority. And their view of the product and the product category is likely not going to change significantly. So again, people below the level of purchase authority are still going to have useful insights that can be gathered.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it goes back to your earlier point about doing the research under your own name versus using a third party or using a sort of pseudonym to do it with. Most PIs will give you more filtered and blunt answers. And I think more junior members of an academic lab are more likely to be reserved in sort of critical points that they might offer.
Right. Going back to the issue of setting up the customer panels, what you're really driving for is a series of one-on-one interviews, ideally on Zoom, ideally recorded so that you can go back and you and others within the company can review the conversation. And generally what you want in these interviews is typically 6 to 8 questions that are relatively open-ended. So not yes, no questions, but questions that are going to require a more complex answer from the respondent. And going back to the original question about goals, what you're really looking for here is one, not to validate your assumptions. And this is a big mistake I see a lot of people make, where they've got a set of assumptions about the market, about how their product is purchased, and they use the surveys and the interviews to try to validate those assumptions. What you're trying to do is to falsify those assumptions. You're looking for all the things that you think are true but are not true. And you're looking for any evidence to indicate that what you assume about the market is in fact not the case. And what that means is you're really looking for what I call the unknown unknowns. You're looking for, what you want is to have them say something that's completely unexpected, something that doesn't match what you would have expected them to say or to respond, and have them respond in a way that's out of your own expectation. And when that occurs, what you want to do is to basically follow the rabbit trail, even at the expense of not asking all of the survey questions during the interview. Because what you're looking for is something about how they view the market that is at odds with how you imagine that they view the market. And so it's these sorts of nuggets that you're really trying to extract. The other thing that you're trying to extract is the language they use to talk about the problem and to talk about the solution. Because ideally, what you'd like to do is to take their own language that's rattling around inside their own heads and feed that back to them when you talk about your solution and when you talk about the sort of problems you solve. And if you're using fundamentally different language than they're using, there is a discordance there that is going to put up a barrier for them to be able to accept what you're saying.
Right. So there's a couple of things I would offer in addition to what you said. One is when we're looking for if we're looking for the unexpected, the best type of questions to ask are the open-ended questions. So this tends to mirror the techniques that we use in sales when we're trying to discover information about a customer's problem. Is if you ask questions with a yes or no answer, or if you ask Matlock style, isn't it true that you were at the Society for Neuroscience on September 24th? No, you don't want to ask that. And So that's useful. I think the other technique that I would suggest, especially for people that are attempting this themselves, would be to rehearse the interview, right? You're going to go through these sequentially. And so by the time you get to the last one, you'll be quite good. But if you spend the time to do one or two practice interviews first, then that first interview you do with your actual prospect is going to be a lot smoother and more informative.
Right. And the other thing that you want to do is after every single interview, if you discovered something unexpected, you want to try to incorporate that into the questions you ask in the next interview. Because what you're looking for is, did I just accidentally stumble across a complete crank? Or is this something that is a universally accepted thought? And so what you're wanting to do is, again, to make sure that what you think you just discovered is in fact true and in fact is representative. And again, most of these things that you discover are not going to be universally true, but if it's true for 20% of your market or 50% of your market, it's important to know because that allows you to then incorporate those ideas and that language into future conversations with your customers.
Right. Any final thoughts, Dale, before we close it out?
No, other than you should be able to do set up and run these customer panels fairly quickly, fairly inexpensively. Typically, I've run these in the span of a couple of weeks. It might take a little bit longer if it's tougher to try to get that initial list put together. The surveys are often done very quickly within a couple of days, the actual interviews. And typically you never need more than my experience has been 8 to 12 conversations for a given set of questions. Because what will happen is that with each additional person you talk to, you're going to hear more and more of what you've already heard and less of new things. And you're going to reach a point to where basically 99% of everything you're hearing is stuff you've already heard. And that point is typically going to happen around 8 to 12 conversations. At that point, there's no reason to talk to 100 people if you can get the answers from 10. And so the idea is to be as efficient as possible with this process. But it's also, the other thing is you're trying to develop intuitions and understanding about the market. So this isn't a hardcore quantitative research effort. This is a qualitative research effort. And you're not going to get hardcore data out of this. You're going to get intuitions and understanding out of this. But it's those intuitions and understanding that's going to feed back into, what do you say on a sales deck? What do you say in a webinar? How do you describe your product? These become very crucial pieces of information that you can gather. And then the final thing is that once you've built this panel, this group of people, you want to come back and revisit them every 6 to 12 months with, not necessarily with the same questions, typically with new questions, because your own understanding of the market, as you talk to more people and you do more marketing and more sales, your own understanding is going to grow over time. And so you want to come back and revisit people within this group with new surveys and new interviews every 6 to 12 months to be able to continue to get course corrections on what you're doing on both the marketing side and the sales side.
Sounds like a good place to leave it. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Absolutely.